And welcome back to our live show. Often unmarked and abandoned, dozens and dozens of African-American cemeteries right here in Virginia hold the key to family histories and stories of the Commonwealth's past. Our next guest has researched and compiled her findings in a new book called Hidden History, African-American Cemeteries here in Central Virginia. We welcome author and professor Dr. Lynn Rainville here to Virginia this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you. This, I understand, was a project that came to you by coincidence because you happen to have a cemetery like this where you work.
That's right. I moved here in 2001 from New Hampshire, and I was hired by Sweetbriar College and soon found out that they had a slave cemetery on campus, and I was very curious about that and who might be buried in that cemetery. And that started a project that at first was just going to be the study of one cemetery and ended up being over 150 historic black cemeteries.
Well, let's start with that first cemetery. What did you find there that inspired you so much?
Well, the first most surprising thing was that none of the stones were inscribed. There were no names or dates. Instead, they were handcrafted and carved, locally available field stones. And that made me curious to figure out, well, who might be buried under these stones? And that opened up a large amount of archival research. And from there, I started looking at other cemeteries to see if this pattern was repeated or not for antebellum historic black cemeteries.
So did you find answers in that first cemetery?
I'd say more questions than answers, but it did make me realize that in Central Virginia, what most people don't realize is that the population of African Americans prior to the Civil War in a lot of the counties was 50% or higher. So while today African Americans are often 19% of the population in a lot of these counties, there were a lot more people that we have to account for and tell their stories from the antebellum period.
And your research took you to dozens and dozens, about 150 cemeteries all across Central Virginia, which is an amazing number in and of itself. So how do you do research like this? Where do you start?
Well, so from the slave cemetery, I realized that in order to understand the mortuary rituals of enslaved communities, I would have to study what happened before and afterwards. So the afterwards part meant that I started studying postbellum church cemeteries, segregated public cemeteries, and then went on to the present. So if people are looking for these cemeteries, you start by looking at old maps, you look at old deeds, you start asking people like hunters who tend to know where they're located. You go to historical societies, and you spend a lot of time outdoors looking for these suspicious, low-standing stones that are out there just waiting for people to find them.
These are things someone probably might even just walk over not knowing what kind of treasures are there.
Yes, the earlier ones that don't have names and dates on the stones, people could easily mistake them for a series of rocks.
And as you're walking through, you've discovered a lot of things. You've had to encounter a lot of things. You were saying that you don't necessarily dress like this when you're out doing research like this.
No, I quickly found out, being used to the northern cold, I found out that here in Virginia, especially if you do this in the summer, that between the ticks and the snakes and the bears and the hunters themselves, that you really want to do this in December if possible with boots on.
And you really never encountered a bear, though, did you?
No, I saw the footprints of bears, which was plenty for me.
Where there are footprints, there are usually bears somewhere nearby. In telling these stories, how do you want people, or what do you want people to know from this research? What do you want them to learn?
I think there are two really important takeaways. The first is that cemeteries are not these sad, morbid places. They're places of outdoor history. And if you visit these old black cemeteries, you have a lot to learn about people who are no longer with us in these lost communities. And the second thing that I would ask people to take away from this is that most of us aren't going to leave behind, we're not a Jefferson, we're not leaving behind the Monticellos or even diaries or letters that anyone will read. But all of us, most likely, will leave behind a gravestone. And so that's a really valuable piece of biographical information. And in the case of African American history in Virginia, if you start studying thousands and thousands of these stones, you can put together some of the histories of these communities that have otherwise been overlooked in more formal histories.
Tell us maybe one or two of the stories that you've learned that have really set into your heart and mind about someone's grave that you found.
Well, really one of the most compelling things that I've been able to do is locate a stone from the early to mid-19th century and then track modern-day descendants and help them recover the location of these cemeteries and where their ancestors are buried. As I soon found out in the case of a lot of African Americans who are descended from enslaved communities, it's not very easy for them to do genealogical research to figure out where their families were enslaved, and sometimes gravestones are that key. They're not always inscribed, but sometimes they are, and so that's been one of the most compelling things for me. And in terms of stories, I guess it's looking at these stones and seeing lifelong commitments, husbands and wives who are buried together, who were born in the 18 teens, born enslaved, lived much of their life enslaved, but then died in the late 19th century and remained together that whole time with their family. Because a lot of times people think about slavery and think about African American families being always disrupted. And while they certainly were in many cases, it's that strength of the human bond and making an effort to stay together for a century, half of which included slavery.
And these cemeteries are now being preserved, including that first one that attracted you at Sweetbriar College, even though the future of the college is up in the air right now. You were telling me that cemetery is preserved.
Right. Well, I should add that it is, of course, a state statute that you cannot disturb human remains or the funerary architecture associated with them. So by that definition, all cemeteries are inherently preserved. And so I think the challenge for all of us is to proactively locate these cemeteries that have often been, their locations have been forgotten. Locate them, get them onto tax maps so that in the future no one disturbs them either by mistake or intentionally. But certainly the slave cemetery at Sweetbriar will be protected.
Well, it's some amazing research, Dr. Lynn Rainville. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And you can meet and talk with Dr. Lynn Rainville tonight starting at 6 o'clock at Chop Suey Books on West Carey Street here in Richmond. She'll be signing copies of Hidden History, African American Cemeteries in Central Virginia, her new book.